Jessica, I wanted to ask about the question of identity and where that's going as an industry. And I know, given your years at Nielsen and now at Innovid, it's a big thing. It's been part of the conversation for years that you've been involved with. Where do you think we are in terms of creating a more future-proofed identity landscape?
Yeah, well, so if we look at the last year and a half or so, when Google announced the deprecation of the DCMID and the sort of the end of the cookie, naturally that kind of set off a flurry of activity and a lot of questions. And I think there was sort of a rush to some short-term fixes. And that's really understandable. Marketers and agencies have relied upon that ID space and built systems and data and insights upon it. And so when it's sort of like the leaky bucket analogy, when there's a leak, you want to kind of rush to fill it. So that was, sort of perfectly understandable. But I think as an industry, we're not really serving the market at the end of the day by just kind of slapping a Band-Aid on what is becoming, really a broader issue. And so, when we look out over the next, in the short term, certainly, but over the next year or two, what's required to future-proof and provide, more contemporary approach to identity really comes down to a couple of things. I think it starts with independence, absolutely, privacy compliance, privacy respect, both for the consumer and the advertiser. And then lastly, this theme of interoperability. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that we'll see the emergence of a new single standard that becomes kind of the de facto, if you will. I think this has been a lesson that that has some frailties. And so what we see is more of a means to having a system of layers of identity that can be connected. So those are important pillars. And, I think when we look at, specifically certain channels, obviously we spend a lot of time in the connected TV space. What we're also seeing is the emergence of, more nuanced approaches to identity that kind of contemplate that large device in the home. It's cookieless by nature. Cookies don't operate in the connected TV environment, and so the future really looks to having much more of a modern approach that allows for again those principles of privacy and interoperability.
So what does that look like? Does it look like first-party data? Does it look like new kinds of panels? Does it mean what shape will identity take? What will power it?
Well, I think there's a lot of layers to that. One way to look at it certainly is, what is the role that identity is playing for a particular use case? And, there's a lot of great industry work happening to bring together, big platforms to understand consumer behavior across those different platforms or walled gardens. And so that's necessary because we live in an omni-channel environment, and so you can't have big blind spots. So I think that includes a mix of panels and different integration of different whether it's identity or first party data. That's kind of a bigger question. I think sort of more of a longer term approach. I think if we just look at the here and now, you could argue that we're living in a streaming first world. It was certainly upon us, but I think the last couple of quarters have shown us that really things have moved pretty substantially with stay at home orders and mindset. And we saw a bunch of really interesting behaviors over the last couple of months, certainly with streaming, with viewership increasing. We saw that correspond to growth in ad spend around connected TV, certainly. And so with that, there's sort of an urgency here to understand how to leverage connected TV to drive scale, to manage frequency, and ultimately to adhere to brand goals. And so I mentioned that because again, I think this is important when we come back to the data equation. We do have to have tools and systems that contemplate the television and the streaming devices as part of that, because they have different data that come with them. Again, I mentioned cookies don't exist in that environment. And so what we don't want to replicate is accounting for identity or behavior, whether it's using panel approaches or data-driven approaches, and not account for that. And because of that urgency, what we see is a lot of really great questions and work emerging to respond to those that sort of need in the market right now. And I think why that's important, particularly again in connected TV. Often there's a lot of concern about over frequencying and not being able to achieve scale. And so the key really to unlocking that is an understanding of how consumers are exposed to advertising at a household level. So that's an important element. Again, understanding, that's a piece of it, and understanding exposure across all of those channels really does require some of those broader industry initiatives to happen. There's some really interesting work too that's happening at somewhat the atomic level. There's a committee called AMSI, which stands for Advertising Metadata Standardization Initiative, and it's a collaboration between SIM, the ARF, the IAB, a number of companies, including IRI and others, as well as AdID. And the goal there was to look at where does this stuff kind of break down from a utility perspective, particularly from the perspective of analytics and practitioners that are trying to make sense of all of this data. And one of the things that we learned is that when you look at how data moves through the supply chain, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I mean, we don't label things the same way. We use different terminology. Timestamps don't line up. And so it sounds pretty, simple and straightforward. And the good news is there is that low-hanging fruit. So I think we can make a lot of progress towards the fragmentation that often we hear about under the guise of identity. Initiatives like that will go a long way in the near term, because standardizing and sort of allowing for consistency across how metadata is used extends very naturally to the identity and ID spaces as well.
So, Jessica, tell us how that sort of fits into Innovid's business, particularly both on the ad serving side and also on the creative advertising side. Both parts of the business. Where does identity fit into what you guys do?
Sure. So, we have TV in our blood. And so we have developed a TV-centric approach to building an identity technique. It's a household ID. And it's built on our ad serving platform. So it's got privacy built in, which again is critical in this day and age. But we have a unique source of truth as well, because we're looking at exposure at the device level and using the CTV ad management signals that we see to kind of orchestrate that. We cluster those IDs at a household level, and that's what powers a lot of our advanced analytics, going back to how can we unlock core elements like reach and frequency in that channel. Moving into personalization, that's an incredibly important part of the marketer's toolkit. And we saw from some research that we did in 2019 that nearly half of marketers were using some sort of advanced creative as part of their campaign activation. And so we only see that increasing. And there's really two things here, Andy, that are at play, and they're very relevant for right here and right now. The first is relevance. And so if you think about it, it's always been the promise of advertising to have the right message, the right moment, the right time. And right now, because of variations of experiences that consumers are having around the country, depending on where they live, the need to be able to create a message that is resonant and reflective of that experience is really critical. And that agility, the ability to kind of turn on a dime and reimagine that message using similar creative, but to speak to someone that is in California versus someone who's in Ohio, those are, small data adds up to a pretty big impact. And so, we're seeing more of that, certainly during the last couple of quarters. We had a lot of advertising partners who really needed to reflect what was happening in certain markets. So think of automotive dealers who had, certain lots open in some DMAs and perhaps not in others, or grocery retailers that maybe had curbside delivery in certain markets, but online delivery in others. And so the need to have that relevant message can be achieved through things like, geographic location, small amounts of data that can allow that personalization to take place. So the reason we think it's important is because also the evidence shows that it works. When we look at, campaigns that have those kind of KPIs and that relevance built in, oftentimes we'll see upwards of 40% engagement, whether that's measured through click-through activity, more time spent, completion, all those different variables. And so, if anything, what we've learned over the last couple of months is that, the technology allows for that to be true. It is seamless. You don't have to re-traffic tags and things of that nature. So what we often recommend, to our partners is to, think about the KPI, think about the goal that you're trying to achieve with that message, and use a lightweight amount of data. It can actually add up to a pretty big impact. And the good news is that that all of those systems have been pressure tested over the last few months, and the impact for marketers is really significant.